February 1933, Martin County, Kentucky. A religious revival spiraled into hysteria, fear, and eventually murder. Newspapers across America called it a human sacrifice. The people involved became known as the cult of the unknown tongues. But nearly a century later, the real story is far more complicated than the headlines ever wanted to admit. This case has everything: religious extremism, speaking in tongues, Appalachian folklore, family trauma, and sensational journalism, and a community that is still haunted by what happened to this very day. And honestly, once I started researching this case, it stopped feeling like a random old bizarre newspaper story, and it actually started feeling like a deeply tragic family story. Because at the center of all this was an actual woman, 72-year-old Lucinda Mills. And tonight I'm digging into the history, the hysteria, and the legacy behind one of Kentucky's strangest, quote-unquote, cult killings. In Kentucky, some stories never get finished. They linger unanswered, unresolved, and often forgotten. This is Buried in the Bluegrass, a true crime podcast from OleGergMedia. Each episode will dive into cases from across the Commonwealth, focusing on documented facts and those pesky little unanswered questions. Welcome back, and thanks for joining us as always. Before we even talk about the murder, though, we need to understand where this happened and talk about our county of the episode, Martin County, Kentucky. Martin County sits in far eastern Kentucky along the West Virginia border, deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Now, modern-day Martin consists of Inez, Warfield, and you have unincorporated communities of Beauty, Job, Lovely, Laura, Pilgrim, and of course what we're talking about tonight, good old Tomahawk. And even to this day, it's still a very rural community. In 2020, the census said there was a little over 11,000 residents, and then in 2024, it dipped just below 11,000. And in the 1930s, this region was isolated in ways today people just can't even imagine. Limited roads, limited communication, limited law enforcement. Families live scattered throughout the hollers and the creek valleys, and often miles apart. And usually when you get into a holler, that's one set of family. That's generations can live in that one holler. And you show up in that holler and you're not part of that family, you might be in trouble. Nowadays, you got the Big Sandy United States Penitentiary in Martin County. But back in the 30s, most everybody there relied on the coal industry. So when the Great Depression came rolling in, Eastern Kentucky got hit pretty hard. But despite the poverty, back then everybody was so close that neighbors depended on each other to survive. Religion became basically a center of the daily life. This was, you didn't have internet, you didn't have your cell phone, you couldn't just go jump in the car and go see your uncle and cousin down the street. And church wasn't just on Sunday and Wednesday or whatever. Church was daily. It became it was more than church. It was your identity. It was your social life. That's how you met people. That's how you got your emotional support. And I'm not sure if anybody here has ever seen a revival, even nowadays. Usually, around back where I'm from, the Baptists, they put on about a week-long revival once or twice a year, it seems like. And then there's some people, you say a revival, they're like, what is it? What's a revival? No, they never heard of it. Like, it's just odd Appalachian folklore to them. And back in the day, they proved that with the newspaper coverage. The reporters from major cities, they freaked out. It was frightening and bizarre to them, the Pentecostal beliefs and practices. But to many of these families back in the hills, it was normal to them. And honestly, part of the story is how the deeply Appalachia itself is misunderstood by the rest of the country back in that day. Now, with that being said, let's talk a little bit about the Pentecostal beliefs and even the hardcore snake handling sects. S-E-C-T, not S-E-X. I have to clarify because I'm kind of a redneck, and yeah, I may have a twang. Not that anybody had noticed that or anything, But Pentecostal Christianity focuses heavily on direct spiritual experiences through the Holy Spirit. Things like speaking in tongues, hence the name, the cult of the unknown tongues, faith healing, emotional preaching, laying on hands, which goes right along with the faith healing. The preacher will lay hands on a parishioner and heal them of their ailments, so to speak. And, of course, intense revival worship. Now, obviously, speaking in tongues became the central part of this case. Believers viewed it as heavenly language inspired directly by God. And now, I'm not sure if anybody has personally experienced Pentecostal churches, but yeah, if that's the language of God, that's a strange language. And to me and other outsiders, it can sound frightening and a little bit chaotic. Now, speaking of chaotic, that's where the good old snake handling sects come in. That was usually some small holiness sects of the Pentecostal church. Not every Pentecostal church are snake handlers. In fact, most of them actually outright reject the ideal completely. Those small sects literally handled venomous snakes during worship as proof of divine protection. Others practiced extreme fasting, faith healing, and emotional spiritual rituals. Like I said, most Pentecostal churches do not do the snake handling, but the isolated church here in the hills and the hollers and the mountains, they tended to develop their own interpretations of the scripture without oversight from the larger religious organizations. And now combine emotional revivals, isolation, fasting, exhaustion, grief, and the fear of a demonic possession, things can spiral very quickly, as this story will show. Now, getting into the actual story, the main protagonist here would have to be John Hampton Mills. John was born in Martin County in 1899 and came from a very large Appalachian family, one of 14 children born by Laban Mills and Lucinda Mills. 14 children. Yeah, I said that right. Now, by local standards, John was considered educated, considering he had an 8th grade education. For the area and the time, that was about as good as you're going to get. Now, obviously, he worked the land, and then eventually he found work with the Cumberland Gas Company as a repairman. In 1924, he met his wife, Alma Ida Hall, from Ashland. They got married and started building a family and welcomed 5 children into their homes. And like everything was going good until it wasn't. His daughter, Avenel, suddenly died. Some reports said it was from the measles. Back then, they even had a doctor come in and look, and basically told him there's not a lot he could do. Once this happened, basically it devastated him. Like he was unable to hold his job. He lost his job. He consumed with grief, and just basically he turned to his Bible and buried himself in the Bible, looking for answers as to why this would happen. Now, this is where our boy William Henry Duty comes into the picture. And dude, I don't know if you can. I'll post a picture on the Facebook, but just looking at this guy, he looked shady as hell. But turns out he was a farmer who basically got tired of working on his farm. He decided that he was going to turn to the Pentecostal preacher and make money that way. And from the reports, he was a snake handling preacher. Now, the snake handling, it kind of threw John off a little bit. He wasn't so much on it, but the Pentecostal beliefs, the speaking in tongue, that really grabbed a hold of him, and he'd found his calling. So John and William Duty started the Pentecostal church there in Tomahawk, Kentucky. Now, at first, the church did great. They were actually pulling some of the Baptist people away from church. Other churches were, in fact, getting mad from losing parishioners. Now, tensions between the two men basically erupted, and from all accounts, John put the hurting on William H. Duty and was literally cast out of the church that he helped build. But John H. Mills ain't going to be deterred. He decided he was going to start his own Pentecostal church, and he had a small flock of about 30 people following. They were drawn in with that promise of divine revelations. So then came the fasting, the singing, the dancing, the sleep deprivation, and 2 weeks of what they called a revival. It was early February 1933, and the members of the Mills family and the small flock of 30 gathered at the Boyd home near Tomahawk in what became a multi-day religious revival. Witnesses later described nonstop praying, fasting, shouting, dancing, speaking in tongues, and emotional trances. And as the revival continued and went along, the atmosphere became increasingly unstable. That's when John Mills had his revelation. He had received a divine message, he told the flock, that a human sacrifice would be required. William H. Doody was the chosen target because, let's just face it, I mean, who's your biggest op but William H. Doody? But apparently William H. Doody was smart enough to not show up to the Boyd's house for the revival and probably saved his own life in the process. So with him out of the picture, Jim had to look elsewhere. He actually looked at his own blood. He attempted to sacrifice his sister Ora Moore and his sister-in-law Trixie Mills. Now, apparently he wanted people who were willingly going to offer their sacrifice. They had to be willing to do this. And Trixie Mills, I think it was at last minute decided she wasn't willing. Now, when that failed, he set his sights on the daughters of Tommy and Talia Boyd. It's actually at this point where our victim steps in, Lucinda Mills, and offers to sacrifice herself to save her granddaughters. So now John has his willing participant, and it's his own mother. Now, apparently, according to everything, all reports, he literally chained his mother down and got on top of her and strangled her in front of 8 of his followers while they danced around and chanted, while they were in a religious fervor which prevented them from stopping John from murdering his mother. Now, the flock may not have tried to stop him in any way, but the neighbors had already become alarmed. They said they had already contacted Sheriff Harry Horn because they were afraid something dangerous was happening inside the house. Which obviously they were correct. I mean, people had stopped eating, people had stopped sleeping normally. They all feared the demons were spreading throughout the group, and they are willingly participating in a human sacrifice. That says enough in itself. And honestly, like, one of the saddest parts of this is that the descendants who talked about the case later on was like, her grandmother literally referred to Lucinda as that poor little old lady. And for some reason, that line sticks with me because behind all the folklore, the sensational headlines, there's literally an elderly woman trapped in the middle of a complete psychological collapse inside of her own family. Long before the headlines spread across America, Sheriff Harry Horn already knew something in Tomahawk was definitely not right. Neighbors had reported screaming, strange religious behavior, and a growing fear surrounding the Mills gathering. As the rumor spread that things inside the Boyd home were spiraling out of control, Horn turned to the deputies and trusted local men familiar with the hills and hollers surrounding Tomahawk. But by the time the deputies arrived at the Boyd home on February 8, 1933, it was already too late. According to the testimony, deputies forced their way inside and found Lucinda Mills dead. Investigators said that John H. Mills had strangled his mother during what participants believed was some form of divine ritual or sacrifice. Newspapers immediately exploded with sensational headlines like mountain cult murder, human sacrifice, unknown tongue sect. Now, some of the reports claimed that multiple people inside the revival had already been marked for death before Lucinda became the victim, which we already talked about. And obviously others alleged that earlier attempts had been made against other family members, which, like I said, we talked about. If nothing else, you can say John was persistent. Now, around the same time in Detroit, there was a similar ritual killing, quote unquote. And now a lot of people like to point this and point out the prejudice that there actually was against Appalachia at the time. The Detroit story barely got any press whatsoever, while obviously the Eastern Kentucky hill folk, they didn't get reported on. They literally got amplified. It exploded internationally because it reinforced every stereotype America already believed about the mountain communities: poverty, isolation, superstition, and religious fanaticism. So to the rest of the world, they're like, yep, see, told you so. Now, one source and person I relied on heavily for researching this one is Harry Reid and his book, The Tongues of Deception. Now, when I read this book, I assumed that it was an older book, whatever. This case is an older case. Got to looking into it and on Harry's Facebook, and it's actually a very recent book, 2023 it came out. And by far, that is the best story. Like, go read it. It's on Audible. Buy the book. Like, that is the best story you're going to find about this subject. Like, literally, I finished it in Audible in less than a day. But it will provide, like, the family members, the names, the details, the backstories, everything that I can't get into on this unless I wanted to make it a complete series, and then I'd just be copying the book because he's done such a great job telling the story. And from Harry H. Reid's Facebook, it actually appears that this might be a full-length feature film soon. And it's wild. You Google almost anything to do with this case, and within the first page, I will guarantee there is a link to his page on Facebook because he's done so much research and posted so many pictures. Like, I feel like I'm robbing from him just to do this episode, and that's not what I'm intending to do. So, yeah, thanks for the research, because wow. But his book explores how emotionally charged religious environments can evolve into manipulation, at the very least, hysteria, and unquestioned obedience. Because, you got to ask yourself, even today, you're like, who would join a cult? Lots of people join cults. It's a psychological thing, and a lot of people do not understand that and do not understand psychology at all. For example, right here, this didn't, like, John H. Mills didn't start out as an evil person looking to kill his mother. Let's start, he started with the death of his daughter, which put him into a deep depression. He lost faith in the Baptist religion. He looking for something new. It was loss, fear, desperation. He's literally searching for the meaning in the hardest part of his life. Then, like, a chance meeting with William H. Doody. Like, come on now. Like if he had never met that man, he'd have never killed his mother. It's straight up. It's just coincidence happened to push him into this lane. Then you add in, like, the crazy beliefs of the Pentecostal, the sleep deprivation, the starvation, emotional overload, the group pressure. Like, it dramatically can affect somebody's mental state. They had him believing he was meant to preach the word, and he was literally receiving God's word personally. And in turn, his flock believed it as well. I just can't imagine what I would believe if I've been fasting, dancing, singing, praying, chanting for days upon days, like long enough and loud enough to where the neighbors come to check on the children. That's yeah. It's untelling what I'd be thinking at that point too. But as we have figured out in modern times, it's not the best thing to do to a person. I'm pretty sure we do that in the military to torture people now. The case became national news almost immediately, obviously. Even the New York Times covered the trial. John Hampton Mills was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison. Ballard Mills and Blaine McGinnis received 21-year sentences. Other defendants were acquitted and had charges dismissed, but even after the trial ended, the story never really disappeared. It simply turned into folklore. Books, podcasts, historical websites, oral histories. People are still debating the case nearly a century later, and one of the strangest parts, John H. Mills was eventually paroled and later returned to Martin County. Now, when I say eventually, it wasn't like it was 15 to 20, 10 to 15. 8 years. In 1941, John was paroled. Alma divorced him and fled to Kentucky. She left. He actually went to Ohio for a while, worked for Goodyear. He married and divorced the same lady 3 times. And eventually he returned to Martin County and lived near the sister he once tried to sacrifice. That is insane. He ended up dying on June 15th, 1968, and he is buried beside his daughter, basically whose death started a whole story. I mean, if you want to break it down. If you'd like to hear the entire story, like I said, I highly recommend Tongues of Deception by Harry H. Reid. I'll put the link in my show notes. I easily found it on Audible. It's very well researched, and for that matter, you can go to his Facebook page, and he's got many of posts where he creating the book. He's got several other books. Like I just highly recommend checking him out. Definitely worth giving him a follow. The story of Lucinda Mills isn't just about religion or murder. It's about grief, isolation, media sensationalism, and how quickly fear can consume people. And it's a reminder that behind every headline, there are real people and real communities living with the aftermath long after the reporters leave town. If you enjoyed this episode of Buried in the Bluegrass, make sure you follow the podcast wherever you listen. You can also follow OleGergMedia on Facebook, TikTok, YouTube, and at OleGergMedia.com. If there's a Kentucky mystery, folklore story, or true crime story you think I need to cover, send it my way. I'm Old Gerg, and until next time, some stories don't stay buried.